Our next talk at Hope 2020 will chronicle the experience of a group of librarians who used an inspired hacker mindset and the resources available to them to aid the public in fighting the COVID-19 pandemic. Presenting Librarians and Crisis Response, please welcome Medea Choksi, Moacir de Saperera, and Alex Hill.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much, Rob.
Thank you for inviting us.
Hello, thank you.
So I'll get started, and I'm actually going to start with sharing my screen and introducing myself. So I'm Medea Choksi. I'm the Research and Learning Technologies Librarian at Columbia University, and my colleagues Alex and Moacir, as well as a number of others, collaborated together with me on this project that we like to call COVID Maker Response. So I'll get us started here, and I've put together a little photo essay to help tell my story, and so that you don't have to read a lot of text, just to sort of let you know about how this came to be and what the process was for this project to come together and flow. So I'm going to share my screen and start with this photo essay. Okay, so here we go with part one. Here we are with our prototype face shields. So how did this come to be? Well, in March, as everyone knows, we were hit with COVID-19 in the United States, and Columbia University, being in New York, was going through some devastating numbers and was hit very hard with the pandemic. In my sort of normal capacity at work, I manage the 3D printing services. So I will help students, staff, and faculty engage with 3D printers, model anything they want to test out, print something out for class, take a quick lesson. And so under normal circumstances, I would be helping out, thinking of ways that I could contribute to the PPE shortage, to any sort of questions coming in related to the PPE shortage, which were few and far between until one, about the end of March, from a doctor who was working at the Columbia University Medical Center named Pierre Elias, and that's who you see on your screen right there. And Pierre Elias reached out to me and said, I see your contact information, and I'm wondering if there's any way that you could help 3D print a face shield for me. I've attached some things I've seen on the internet here, and I wonder how we can use the printers that the library currently has to print some of these out for us, these reusable shields. So again, under normal capacity, normal circumstances, I would be like, yeah, absolutely, tomorrow I'll have it ready for you. Just share the file with me. But this is COVID. We had been remote for about a week. Campuses were shut down across the city, and Columbia's main campus was closed, as well as the medical campus. So I didn't have any access to the tools that I would need to put this together, namely the 3D printers. But I saw an opportunity here, and also just thought that this is something that is so beyond just, saying no, bureaucracies, and we can't make it happen. And I just sort of challenged that and pushed myself to do what I could. I actually reached out to Pierre the same night and asked him for his phone number. I said, can I, phone you and let me hear a little bit more about this shield in particular, and let me take a look closely at the file. And I think it's something that could be printed really quickly, and let me see what I can do. And so once I spoke to him, I realized sort of how serious the situation was. And I wrote sort of up the library chain and disclosed what was happening, what Pierre's request was. And I wondered if I could get onto campus and print a prototype out. Could I just go in, print a shield, give him one, and then go from there? To my surprise, the answer was yes, you can actually go onto campus. We're going to make this happen for you. This was within 24 hours. We'll make this happen for you, and you can go in tomorrow. So I actually ended up tweeting all of this so I can share with you what it looked like later on. when I was able to share this out to friends and colleagues. This is from Butler Library, where I was able to go in and actually bring the printers home. So I packed up this cart with the 2 3D printers that I could fit in my little New York apartment, all of the filament that I could find, and bring them home. This is the setup at home in a little tucked away in a corner, sort of just fit. And then I pressed go and watched them print. So essentially what ended up happening was within 40 hours, I had about 6 prototype shields, ran over to my neighborhood Staples, which thankfully was open, grabbed some rubber bands, some foam tape to put this design together. The Budman Industries design is the one that I used with some modifications to expedite the printing time, mainly how dense the layers were and spaces in between the holes that were being punched. So by the end of almost that, pretty much the end of that day, I handed Pierre, who came by to my apartment, 6 face shields, and he was overjoyed. And that's the picture that I took of him. And he was going to go test them out with his colleagues and see how that would, how they would fit, and if we could print more. Of course, they were in favor of us printing as many as possible. So we got straight to work. I continued to print in my apartment, and very soon after sharing the story on Twitter, I was able to connect with 2 other local print companies. So one not so local but international, MakerBot, and a local company called Tangible Creative, who were located out in New Jersey. So upon connecting with them, they were very supportive of our cause and were interested in collaborating with us and providing us with as many shield visors as they could. And very quickly, we ran out of space in my apartment and hands to assemble these visors. So I got to work sort of very quickly, reaching out to my contacts to see if we could acquire any space in and around the city. Again, COVID, so we knew that there were, empty buildings, empty spaces. We were faced with some more sort of bureaucratic challenges at Columbia, trying to get on campus or to use a campus building for our assembly operation, because we knew we would need a handful of volunteers to help us put this together. And through one of my contacts, I got in touch with the director of operations at the 92nd Street Y, which is a very historic YMHA in New York City, and they offered their space to us at no cost. They said this project is very much in line with their philosophy, and they would be so happy to contribute. They gave us access to their lounge space, which was a very large room in the sort of front of the building, and we were able to bring in 10 to 15 volunteers at once, safe social distancing, and start putting our shields together all at once. So here you don't see our volunteers. This was just the first day that I was able to take all of the visors into the Y, set them up on this line of tables, and start putting them together myself. And that's a photo of the 92nd Street Y, and that's a photo of Pierre with more boxes of visors that I would give to him at the end of the day. So eventually we had a very large operation. As you can see, the room was very large. We would stack visors in 10. We sort of operationalized everything, made the process much more efficient as we were going and producing large numbers. On the left, you see a photo of Tangible Creative. The space that they have out in New Jersey is very large, and they have about just under 60 printers, 3D printers, and almost all of them were producing these shields for us. We had a number of very, very dedicated volunteers, both in the assembly line and outside of the assembly line, who were doing drive deliveries, back and forth from the New Jersey location to the Brooklyn location, which is where MakerBot was located, to the 92nd Street Y, which is located on the Upper East Side. So we had sort of this whole process underway that was iterative, and it was changing constantly. For example, in the beginning of the project, it was, we were at the 92nd Street Y from maybe 10 a.m. to about 11 p.m. or 12 a.m. Just sort of going and boxing and waiting for pickups from frontline medical professionals who were going to come by once their shift ended. And then we sort of made it such that we would maybe send an Uber so that we wouldn't be there so late, so that we could get some rest, and so that we could be there bright and early and recharge the next day, because we recognize that we would be doing this for quite some time. And the project sort of just grew from there. We continued to share these with all of the frontline medical professionals who were requesting these, and these did come with their fair share of challenges. So we would have medical professionals from the same hospital unit, for example, that we would have one unit that was using these shields and another unit that wasn't, and we would be getting emails or requests to say, how do we get these in? How do we use these? We know that another unit in the hospital is using them. Who are you in contact with? So there were sort of these sort of fractured, siloed moments that we were also trying to deal with at the same time. And I think my colleagues later will talk about the website that we built and the guide and all of the work that went on to support this, but sort of just wanted to share some of these photos and use cases here. So another group that we shared our shields with was the fire department of New York and the EMS. And we had a point person there. Her name is Monica, and she's quite famous with us, or our team, who very generously would come by all the time, speak to our volunteers, and be very encouraging, and was our sort of liaison for that group. I look forward to answering your questions, but this is sort of the spiel that I had to share, sort of how this project came to be, and sort of what the grassroots sort of level looked like. Thank you.
Sarah, you want me to go, or I thought you were going first? You want to close up? Okay. All right. Sorry, apologies for mixing up the order. Hi, everybody. Yes. What Madiha describes is the journey, as I remember. It was quite a journey. I'm glad that we were able to join Madiha in this adventure. My comments are going to focus on a couple of things. I'm going to talk a little bit about what communication entailed. I'm going to talk a little bit also about the context for us of doing this type of work at the library. Is not our first rodeo. So I'll be talking a little bit about that. So let me start with some of that work of communications. Because this was grassroots and we were talking to a million different parties at the same time, we felt like we needed to do a couple of things to actually save us time in communications. One of those things that we were doing that we did first was created a guide, because a lot of the requests we were getting in the beginning, when people started finding out what we were doing, were requests about how they could replicate what they were doing. So people were asking us, how can I print these parts myself? How can I assemble these parts myself? So I'm going to share my screen real quick to show you our first attempt at trying to ease the sort of pressure on communications for us. And that was our guide and design for the rapidly produced face shields. And this guide is a sort of step-by-step set of instructions on how to put together these shields, but also has the file that Madiha designed based on the Buttman Industries model, and that was still refined a little further when we started collaborating with people over at Tangible Creative. Now, the second release valve for communication is that for those of you who are listening, sometimes people don't realize that when you're doing these kinds of projects, communication takes like a substantial chunk of the labor. I would say like 1/3 of the labor is just the time you spend talking to different parties. And it's real labor, and people sometimes forget that you have to bake it in, you have to make time for it. And that you should strive to try to create these release valves. The second release valve we created was a sort of information website for the project, which you can see right here. That's the COVID Maker Response project, which now it's in its final iteration. It doesn't have all the parts it used to have. It just has more or less a description of what it is that we did, a couple of pictures, sort of listing of the press coverage of the project, and an email in case people wanted to contact us after the fact. And the website for that is covidmakerresponse.com. And the website for the guide and design for rapidly deployed face shields is too complicated for me to spell out here. If you go to the studio.cval.columbia.edu, you will find it right away, or you can just simply use your search in your browser. Well, in any case, so having done these sort of release valves and then this multi-purpose websites that allow us to take a little bit of that pressure off, which is just send emails with the links to people. Most of the communication work involved talking to nurses and doctors and the different stations that were operating assembly and production throughout the whole day. I was taking point on that for most of the duration of the project in my apartment, and I would wake up around 8:30 and start getting on email and on the phone, and continue to do that for the rest of the day until like 5, confirming pickups, confirming new orders, making sure the driver left the house, and this kind of stuff. So full-time work. Maria would come in and help out once in a while with the communications, and so would Masir. This also involved, of course, talking to the press that was starting to get curious with us, and in general gave me a really good view of what was going on on the ground in hospitals that I wouldn't have gotten otherwise. It gave me an opportunity to actually talk to so many nurses and so many doctors and paint a picture of what dealing with COVID sounded like and looked like every day as events unfolded. And it isn't based on this view that I want to then move on to the second part of my comments, focus on a little bit, expand a little bit on the context of the kind of work that we do at the library at Columbia University Libraries that we have been doing. Because it was during these calls that I learned, for example, that a lot of these doctors and nurses wanted to do this without calling too much attention to themselves. Many of them weren't allowed to actually officially ask for shields or any other form of PPE. And I don't know if some of you in the audience has got to see some of those reports on the press about how some doctors were getting fired for actually going on Facebook or going on Twitter, and nurses too, talking about how the situation at their hospital was dire and how they needed PPE. It turns out that some policies in some hospitals, some strategies coming from PR, et cetera, were actually forbidding people from expressing their need. While this is happening, I'm also seeing that the state and corporate are not doing what they were promising to do. We saw a lot of people promising, we're going to do 200,000 face shields. We're going to do this and that. We knew of some efforts close to us that were just being held back because they were waiting to file a patent, for example. And the crisis kept going, and people were dying, and people were waiting because they wanted to file a patent. We saw the state and the city of New York making promises, and oh, yes, it's coming, and nothing is happening. So I'm talking to these doctors. They're not allowed to say that this is going on. Meanwhile, corporate and state are failing us left and right. And here we were, just a few librarians with working with some volunteers from the med school, George, the delivery guy, who came out of nowhere to drive around parks, our friends at Tangible Creative, and MakerBot, yes, a corporation. But the way it was done there is super interesting, but I'll let them talk about how they did that. But it was, it was only the grassroots. It was only the hacker ethos, as this conference likes to call it, that was actually stepping up at the height of the crisis in the city to provide this kind of protection for hospitals. This is a sad state of affairs that has a lot to do with defunding and sort of like the crumbling infrastructure of the United States. And this is a good segue, this kind of crumbling infrastructure that actually gives rise to hacker ethos. As a hacker ethos doesn't come out of some genius new cultural form. It actually, in my view, in my understanding of it, comes out of the necessity that we are faced to address large infrastructural deficits are all around us. Now, it is in this context then that I want to introduce the concept of nimble tents or mobilized humanities, which we have been exploring in the library for a while. So give a little context. Like I said, this is not our first rodeo. About 3 or 4 years ago when Maria, sorry, I'm getting old and my ears start to blend. When Maria hit Puerto Rico and destroyed the island, me and Wasir were at the library discussing what we were going to do. This was before Madi had joined our team, and a few others at the studio were discussing what we could do. And very rapidly, we decided that we were going to team up and organize a university-wide mapathon to try to respond to the Red Cross's call for improvement of the maps that they were using on the ground through the hot OSM OpenStreetMaps tool. But we didn't want to stop there. So yes, we wanted to invite our students and our colleagues and faculty at the university to come and help us do this mapathon. I imagine most of the audiences here is aware of these kind of mapathons and their history that is more than a decade old, and of OpenStreetMaps. Well, we didn't want to stop there. Well, the other thing we wanted to do is actually make it in such a way that it becomes a model for other libraries in the United States, other centers, to do exactly what we did, and eventually, by aggregation, do the map of the whole island. And indeed, 25 other libraries, mostly, and some universities and some centers joined us. We had shared flyers, step-by-step guides on how to do this. They joined us, and we rebuilt the map of the island. Madiha today is still doing those mapathons in the studio, for example. So this is something we did like 4 years ago, and we still continue to do this. And now that we have finished, for example, with this, with COVID Maker Response, we'll probably go back to continuing doing these kinds of mapathons, and Maria is in charge of running that operation. If you want to ask her more in the question and answer about that. Now, after that, after that, we, like a year after, I don't know if you remember, the family separation crisis of 2018, when we started seeing images of these kids being separated at the border from their mothers, and the kids crying for their parents. This was when the zero tolerance policy of the Trump administration hit us hard, and America all of a sudden kind of woke up to the sort of cruelty that is happening at the border. When that happened, same as we did when Maria hit Puerto Rico, we got together at the studio, a team of us, and we asked ourselves, what are we going to do? And fairly quickly, we decided that we were going to react. Put a team together outside of Colombia, many others. And in 7 days, we mapped out the carceral infrastructure of ICE. Now, some of you may have already seen this. It's an interactive map It's a series of interactive visualizations that map out ISIS impact in the United States of America, including the detention centers where they had the kids. In 7 days, we went on rapid exploration and research, deep research, frantic, manic. We didn't stop. We woke up at 6 in the morning and went to bed at 12 for 7 days to map out as much as possible as we could of the physical infrastructure of ICE. Some of the visualization design and the website is done coded mostly by Moisir. I helped out a little bit. We had a team also do. There was a constant team, a team that was each doing something different, like research, compiling a list of allies, etc. That was in 7 days, rapid, nimble, tent. In volume 2, which followed on the heels of volume 1, we also, in a rather speedy way, went to town mapping the financial infrastructure of ICE. By then, we were starting to understand that we were invested in this idea of responding to moments of crisis by bringing together coalitions of people, of the right people, with the right talents to address that crisis. There were many other examples that I'm just going to skip in between here and when we arrive at COVID Maker response. But this practice, this conscious practice of reacting to crisis by putting together teams has actually given us a lot of fodder for thought that I don't have time to share with you the extent of all that thinking that has taken place, but I wanted to highlight a couple of points before passing on the mic and the camera to Moisir. One of the characteristics of this kind of work that I have noticed, something like a common denominator, is that these things that I call nimble tents have in common is that they are extra institutional. They happen outside of the teams that you only have available to you inside your institution where you work. Yes, you pair up with the people inside where you work, but you also pair up with people outside of where you work. 2, they're not grant funded. They can't be because they have to be fast. So the Red Cross cannot wait for you to hear back from Mellon about whether you're going to get a grant in order to help them rebuild the map of the city. You have of the island. You have to react quick. Same with the family separation crisis. We had to react, and same with COVID and with any other example of these exercises that we have done in the past. That poses an interesting question for labor that connects it back to this to this context I was talking about. This idea that the hacker ethos comes about because the infrastructure is not there. That is not to say that the infrastructure couldn't be there and there would be less need for hacking. So I know it sounds paradoxical, but I wish we didn't have to do any of these things. So one way, halfway point, for example, that we can achieve this is if institutions become savvy to this fact and start allowing for time and resources to be dedicated to their staff to be able to do these kinds of responses. Now, let me give you just one last example of the failure of institutions to do this before passing on to Moisir. And that was when we were doing the Maria and its implication. When we were doing Maria, the Maria project, the PR Mapathon, hashtag PR Mapathon, we talked to Microsoft, Google, Amazon, etc. And we said, listen, universities are doing this, libraries are doing this. We think that your employees would love to do this. If you give them like 2 hours on Friday at the end of the week and just let them gather together in the cafeteria, they already know how to do everything, and let them just participate, it would be good for morale boost, and we would get the map done quicker. We would be able to do this quicker. Every person that I talked to was middle management or above, and in every single place that they shut it down. And that's a failure. I actually think that these institutions could have done that and more. And I think so to close, I think that private institutions, public institutions, and the state could do a lot more, and to allow us to have this space where we can go ahead and intervene in crises that are unforeseen, unpredictable, etc. So with that, I'm gonna pass on. Look forward to your questions and answers. Thank you for inviting us. And with that, I'll pass it on to my colleague Masir to close this up.
Thanks, Alex. And thanks, Madiha, for starting us off here. I too am going to share my screen a little bit. So I'll start with the, Alex started talking about nimble tents, and one of the things that we quickly learned when doing these kinds of projects is that we have our fields of expertise that we're good at dealing with, and then we have fields of expertise where we don't really know what we're doing, and sometimes we're successful in finding people who can help with that, and sometimes we aren't. So for example, what brought Madiha into the project in the first place was, as she mentioned, an already existing familiarity with 3D printing, et cetera, so that when the doctors reached out to her, she was already in a position to be able to mobilize her specific skill set in order to help out in a certain way. And in the Mapathon, it was a similar thing. Like the people that organized it, we all had familiarity with making these maps and with dealing with, we conceptually understood what editing these maps involved, even if we had never actually done it on the OpenStreetMap model. So that sort of thing helped out too. But when it came to making these shields, quickly it became clear that one of the big roles was logistics. And my 10 minutes here I call logistics who knew, because who knew that it was a complicated thing. I mean, we actually did, and one of our volunteers ended up being a professor in the engineering school who works with logistics. Like that's his field of expertise, and he helped us out a little bit. But more than anything, a lot of this fell to us. So I kind of want to finish out where Alex, so Madiha started us out in a very organic and materialist perspective, and Alex brought us out into the realms of theory, as is his wont. I'm going to bring us down a little bit to a more materialist view of what this project actually entailed. So the parts of a face shield in Madiha's pictures and in when Madiha was already explaining, you could sort of see that there were a bunch of different things that go into making a face shield. So the first and most important, of course, is labor. Mostly important because it's the easiest to forget about. The reason why we were able to make tens of thousands of shields and deliver them was precisely because we had a labor force. We could have had all the means of production available to us as we wanted, and we still would have needed a labor force. Then there was the visor itself, the screen, a forehead cushion, the head attachment mechanism, the cushion adhesive, and tools and space. This language is a little bit abstract and over formal, but it's only because what we called it on the shop floor, rubber bands, etc., isn't exactly descriptive of what they were actually doing. So the labor was made up, as mentioned, as Madiha mentioned, of mostly Columbia graduate students, but also Columbia staff. And this really involves library staff that worked, that were doing just their regular library jobs, like in charge of procurement, and were working on weekends and that sort of thing, helping out. Columbia faculty and librarians, so the three of us, and then faculty members, et cetera, who helped out with the library, are two non-library partners, Tangible Creative and MakerBot, and then community members, which provided printing resources. George, the driver, who was driving things around the 5 boroughs, And then even other libraries like Brooklyn Public Library lent us 10 3D printers to help print visors. So the visor itself, in an unexpected twist, if you had asked me when we started this project, I would not have guessed this, but in an unexpected twist, the visor ended up being the easiest part to source. We effectively called the cost of each visor to be effectively free because everybody was donating their filament, their time on the machines, and the amount of human labor involved in pulling the visors off of the machines, off of the printers, boxing them, and so on, and mailing them in many cases to us. We counted all of that as free because we weren't charged in any way for it, and it was kind of a real entry point into this project for most people. I think that the role that had the most number of people involved in it probably was printer, 3D printer. And it's a question for the community when trying to think about these sorts of things moving forward, especially within that hacker ethos, about how much of that was because it had this kind of tech sheen to it. Like it was cool to be 3D printing things. It's far cooler to 3D print things and, you know, take video or stop action photography of a 3D printer making something than it is to photograph someone tying knots or making a video of someone tying knots. So it ended up being a funny problem because this was a bottleneck. We had way more supply of visors than we knew what to do with. The next is the screen, which is the part that goes over the face. And this we sourced in 2 different ways. And it's interesting because each way had its own benefits and disadvantages and drawbacks. So we used, for the first set, Madiha started using Duralar, which is a thin acetate-like sheet that involved hole punching holes in to fit onto the visor. And that worked reasonably well. But the problem was that the hole punching, you had to sort of redo every single time. You had to reline up where the holes would be, et cetera. So it was very time consuming, and the Duralar was very expensive and very difficult to source. It quickly sold out on Amazon, and the company that produces it was not terribly interested in selling it to us. So we always had to go through middle companies that were also having their own supply chain difficulties. About midway through the project, the Columbia Makerspace, they had designed their own all-in-one shield that was made out of one sheet of thick plastic that they would fold together origami style and wrap around their head. And it turned out to be the case that there was just enough waste in that single sheet to cut 2 8.5 by 11 sheets that we could use ourselves for our project. So they started giving us these for free too. So even though running the water jet cutter is extremely expensive, and I can't even imagine how expensive it is, we started getting these sheets for free. It was just the effort of going out there and picking them up. And they also, just like the Duralar, they also weigh a lot. But it also became its own production bottleneck because we misunderstood how many of these sheets we were getting. But it also has a bit of a tech sheen too, because, you know, it's really cool that a makerspace is water jet cutting these different things. These are 2 pictures of me. In order to be able to make the sheets usable, we needed to measure out exactly where to punch the holes so that the water jet could drill them in. So I sat and took pictures of myself with a piece of paper before then measuring everything out and sending it to the engineers, who then made our first prototypes that you can see in these photos. The next is the forehead cushion, which was cheap but bulky, but quickly sourced. And it required adhesive and required cutting. But then the other funny thing was figuring out exactly how to attach these visors. So again, we had both very simple problems that are thousands of years old, how to attach something to your head, as well as very new problems like how to 3D print a visor that were competing with each other and competing for time and energy and focus from our volunteers. So the original visors were done with rubber bands, and then we moved to rope for a while, and then we moved back to rubber bands. And the rope I was very proud of it and I thought it worked really well, but the learning curve was exceptionally difficult. So the rubber bands were better. And the rubber bands were also very easy to source from Uline. So you can see how pretty they are once they all go on a visor. The adhesive itself was the most expensive consumable, which is unexpected, and was also difficult to source. So like these supply chain issues persist and will come up at the end here. And then the last was tools and space. We lucked out. Madiha already mentioned the 92nd Street Y. We also, Alex and I live in the same building in Columbia Housing, and we lucked out and were able to get the rec room, which has been closed for use. We were able to get that for using, for building. And so the questions are like, so how did we do it? How did we do all of this? And the answer is basically that we didn't. Production instability led to labor unrest. It became really tricky to keep wrangling the volunteers because every day the question would be like, well, do we have sheets? Do we have foam? And the just-in-time manufacturing that we all thought that we as like clever hackers would be able to enable relies on accurate inventory and predictable supply chains. And we were not able to reliably have either of those. And so we ended up chasing production with what's at hand. So we did very well, I think, but it reached the limits of our abilities. But in closing, the good news is that all of our inventory ended up in shields given to people in need. So it all worked out in the end, but there was a lot of ups and downs on the way there. And that's all from me. And we're at just past 40 minutes. So we're open up to questions now. Thank you.
Moisir and Alex, thank you all very much indeed. I encourage our audience members who are in the live stream session Q&A channel to post their questions that they have for you all, and I will relay them here. And while we're waiting for some questions, are there any final things you'd like to say to wrap up, or things that you took away from this experience?
If I could, I'd like to ask Madiha to tell me more about the sorts of, she only touched on it very briefly, about the kinds of bureaucratic work that she did in order to get the printers up and running. Because she made it sound very simple, but I suspect that it was actually more complicated. And what sorts of things were involved in making it happen?
Sure. So in order to, so a number of things. So to first even to bring the printers home, to even get access to, the lab in which the printers lived, it was jumping through hoops, meeting with public safety, getting a key that opened Butler Library, all very, very unusual and unfamiliar, something that there is no process for. So kind of doing that was already something that I was very nervous about. And then once I was there and beginning to sort of get things ready to bring the printers home, it was a matter of how do I transport this in a way that nothing breaks, or how do I make sure that, the voltage in my apartment is gonna, allow the printer to run. I mean, these are all, of course, like I'm sure I knew that it would be okay ultimately, but it was also sort of just a little overwhelming. So getting that home was one bureaucratic level. Another was keeping the printers even. So just asking for permission to keep them for a little while longer so that I could continue to print. Another was to write very kind emails to request that we buy some more of the filament. So as we were printing more, it was, we need the funds to continue to buy more filament, to continue to produce these shields in the large numbers that we were doing. So there was that aspect to it. And then there was the bureaucracy of the space. So I think there was also, this need for space, and then this need for these 2 printers and potentially more, because we had, as we built out our relationships and connections to different doctors, different medical professionals, groups who were very much in touch and wanted to support our work as we were supporting them, would message us and say, you know, I have a printer here, or I know someone who has a printer and it's in New Jersey, but we can get it to you like tomorrow. Could you use it? And it's like, of course we could, but we need space. So the 92nd Street Y was very sort of critical for us because it allowed us to sort of open that up, and we were able to line up a number of printers, and we were able to sort of get past that hurdle of you know, of like, now there's like a community of printers instead of just Columbia printers. So we have a community that's working together to ensure that they're working if something breaks down. We were able to train some students, student volunteers who had never experienced, never even come across a 3D printer before, you know, under like how to load the filament, for example, how to troubleshoot a printer. So it ended up being sort of its own, you know, hack a 3D printer sort of experience. But I think there's another question, so I'll pause for a second.
A number of members of the audience are wondering how many face shields you were able to make.
Sure, we made just under 26,000. So I think the total was, and Alex or Monsieur, correct me if I'm wrong, but the last I checked, it was about 25,700 and change. And then we had a number of, we had a number of visors and pieces that were left over, and we sort of kept those because we didn't want to overproduce, put our volunteers at risk to continue to produce shields for the New York, New Jersey, for the tri-state area if there were not shields, you know, being disseminated at the same time as they're being produced. So we sort of halted and paused, and then there was a larger need that came up, and we were able to donate those resources to another group in New Jersey that was able to put them to use and share them out. So there was a lot of this coalition building and network building.
One other member of the audience asks, do you have any recommendations for a library member to leverage these sorts of resources and participate in these sorts of projects?
I think yeah, we're also mere mortals. We are.
I would agree.
Yes, that we don't have anything particularly superhuman about us. I think we were learning as we went along. We have never done anything that involved this kind of complex logistics like Monsieur was describing. That wrangled production from a large corporation, a small mom and pop shop, volunteers. We have never done anything like this. I mean, the thing that this had in common with other efforts were like, we know that people can collaborate with each other and bring their skills in and outside of your library. Like, we knew that. We knew that if you keep on, if you insist on being part of the solution and dedicate enough time to researching and enough labor to actually talk to those who have experience, and use a little bit of, you know, cleverness and resourcefulness, that you can actually accomplish these things. I think the key, something that I've noticed is that the key thing is that if everybody kind of organizes themselves into things that we kind of know they're already good at, like even in our own team, even between the three of us, we have different things that we lean, like even though we have generalist tendencies, we have strengths. Definitely. And we kind of mapped ourselves according to those strengths. Yeah.
Just quickly.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, thanks. Just quickly, I want to add that libraries are community spaces, which means that they are open to the community and they're for the community. And part of a community is, like Alex is saying, knowing who is good at what and who can help with what. And it was through these kinds of community connections that we got the volunteers that we did, we got the spaces that we did, and we got everything that we did, including talking our bosses into paying for a lot of it.
Exactly.
And so I think that for a library member, it's about being part of the library as a member and understanding that the library is part of your community and is there to serve the community, which means it's there to respond to your desires and your demands.
Okay, and we will have to leave it there. We're just about out of time, but really quick, where can people go to find more information on your work and what you're doing?
You want to share the link to the studio? You can. There's several places where you'll find our work. The most important one is the Columbia University Library Studio.
And that you can Google.
Yeah, you can Google our names and you will see all the different things we're getting involved. And on Twitter, you can find us all three of us on Twitter. I'm El Otro Alex. Thank you, guys, for inviting us. Thank you, Rob, for being such a great moderator.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all. The link is in the chat.